Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing very well, thank you very much. We might as well all be sitting around a really cosy crackling fire together, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight, and geographical distances don't matter at all, not when we've got the advantage of YouTube, and I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget the two rules. One, you have to get yourself that fabulous drink, whatever it is, and if I don't know about it, I'd like to hear about it. And then, of course, gather together to listen to this story. But first of all, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early 60s when I was 11 years old. I would prefer not to mention my name or the exact location of where this all took place, so I'll call myself Kyle for the purposes of this story. And this happened somewhere in North America, and so I'll leave it at that, because remaining anonymous is exceedingly important to me. I grew up in a rural community. The quaint double-storied houses in our street were both spacious with decent-sized yards, so that our houses were loosely spread out by an abundance of space. All the houses were very well maintained, with perfectly manicured lawns and very pretty gardens full of colourful blooms. There was, of course, one exception to the rule, as is often the case in every rural town. This was the one house that invariably visually let down the whole street, with its shoddy appearance, dilapidated state, and overgrown yard that had not seen a lawnmower in months. It was house number 36, that unfortunately was directly opposite our own home. So our two-storey home, with its open windows and great panoramic views, overlooked this dreadful eyesore that was like a big black blob on a beautiful picture that you just couldn't erase. On either side of our homes were idyllic forests, beautiful silvery lakes and mountainous valleys that stretched back for miles, teeming with an abundance of wildlife from pretty white-tailed deer, the occasional black bear, squirrels, rabbits, and you name it, we had it all, sauntering around the valley and dwelling in the ubiquitous vast areas of wilderness in our part of the world. As you can imagine, my meticulous mother, who never once had a hair out of place and was always scrupulously attired in smart headmistress-style suits, had absolutely no respect for the people at number 36. She would rant and rave to my father about our slovenly neighbours over the road, who when they dared to venture outdoors were still wearing their PJs at 4 in the afternoon. To make matters worse, the portly father, that resembled a very large walrus with his extended girth, would slob around the overgrown garden with a cigarette dangling haphazardly from his mouth and wearing no top whatsoever. Oh, what a dreadful sight, my mother would sigh. Why on earth does that man not wear a top? Does he realise how frightful he looks? Imagine our surprise when the house at number 36 was finally put on the market. But although hopeful, my mother was convinced that no one in their right mind would ever purchase that run-down old shack. She was to be proved wrong when one day we woke up to see a bold red sold sign standing up proudly at number 36. It was like all my mother's Christmases had come at once. She had visions of number 6 being renovated and restored and the garden transformed into a meticulous lawn like the rest of the street. My brother Harry, who was 10 at the time, and I was 11, were in our bedroom, which we shared together on the second story of our home. It had a bird's-eye view of the neighbour's property. One day we saw a furniture removal van parked outside number 36. We could see someone new was moving in, and we hoped with all our hearts it would be a young family with kids of similar ages to ourselves that we could hang around with and play together within the woods. My brother and I watched through our binoculars all the bustling activity going on over the road. 2 very stocky, robust removal men were bringing into the neighbour's house the dreariest, tasteless, drab-looking furniture with only one single bed among all of its items. It distinctly looked like this was a single person's abode, and someone who did not possess even an ounce of style or taste in his tiny finger. Then we saw him, the neighbour who was moving into next door, and he was positively the creepiest man that I have ever seen in my entire life. He would have looked perfect playing the Walking Dead in a zombie movie.
He was tall and thin and rather reminded me of a praying mantis. His dull skin looked distinctly grey with a greenish tinge, and his deep-set dark eyes had a predatory look about them, like that of a vulture. And everything about him was distinctly off, and just observing him from our upstairs bedroom gave me the chills. I knew instinctively that this malevolent-looking character was not someone I would ever like to meet face to face. As the weeks passed, much to my mother's disappointment, no efforts were being made by this older gentleman, if you can call him that at all, to transform the house and restore the yard to some level of decency. If anything, the whole place began to become more dilapidated, if that was at all possible, and the grass continued to remain uncut. "I despair," sighed my mother. "I never knew you could get worse than the previous owner, but this man is distinctly odd." My brother and I noticed how strange our neighbour was, and the way he behaved was positively weird. He would cross over the gravel road to the other side of the street, and then he would purposely slow down and walk past our house like an ant. He would then peer in at us closely, allowing his beady eyes to observe everything and miss absolutely nothing. He would always be thrilled if he actually got a glimpse of my brother and I in the yard, and then his grey face would light up, and he would smile at us with hungry, excited eyes, and a grin that revealed that half his teeth were actually missing. We also noticed that he wore the same shabby tweed jacket and brown pants day after day, without ever refreshing himself with a new change of clothes. So my brother and I had firmly decided that he must smell as bad as he looked. Even his greasy hair that stood up on end like a scarecrow looked like it hadn't been washed a day in his life. It was odd, though, that he was completely clean-shaven, as he didn't seem to bother about the rest of his appearance, not one jot. Often my brother and I would notice that our neighbour would be up to all kinds of activity at the strangest hours of the night. My brother and I would awaken to car doors being shut and engines being started. We would peer out of our window, pulling back the curtains ever so slightly, and we would watch this man putting trowels and bin liners and weird things into his trunk. And on several occasions we did see what appeared to be the shape of a very small body being put into the back of the car, all wrapped up in thick black bundles tied up with white string. It all looked very menacing and ominous, and gave us the distinct impression that this horrible man was up to no good. When my brother and I suggested to my cynical parents that the neighbour over the road was up late at night, we told them that he was a murderer killing small people, and as you can imagine, my parents were furious with us. Even my mother defended the sinister-looking man. "Now, dears, don't be so unkind about the man. You should never judge someone by their appearance. I thought your father and I taught you better than that. You cannot go around the place saying those things. What would people think about you with such crazy allegations?" That was funny coming from my mother, who was exceedingly judgmental. She was the first person that judged anyone and anything. It was like the pot calling the kettle black. One day out of the blue there was this coverage about a missing boy of 11 years old who disappeared after doing a newspaper round very close to where we actually lived. His bike had been found lying in the middle of the white gravel road, but the boy had seemingly vanished into thin air, and no one knew where he was. Some believed he was abducted, and others thought he might be deceased. From that moment my brother and I were convinced that this neighbour of ours was responsible for this missing boy's abduction. That night we were awoken to the sound of the car on the opposite side of the street, that was always lit up well by my mother's outside light. My brother and I watched the man putting what looked like a body wrapped and tied in a rubbish bag. He then got into the car and drove away. Still in our PJs, my brother and I put on some sneakers and raced out of the house as quickly as we could to the neighbour's property, taking the opportunity to snoop around while he was out. "Let's go and look inside his house to see if we can see anything suspicious," I said to my younger brother. "I'm convinced he's behind that boy's abduction. Did you see that body-like shape?" My brother agreed. "Let's go." Eagerly we crossed the gravel road and ran through the overgrown yard towards the dilapidated house that was quite literally falling apart at the seams. To our amazement, the back door to the kitchen was still ajar, and we crept into the house and looked around. The place smelt rank and musty, and there were piles of dirty dishes that had not been washed for what seemed like weeks. I even noticed a few maggots crawling out of half a tin of baked beans and crawling over the counter. "Who lives like this?" I said to my brother. "This place is utterly disgusting." The living room was full of old newspapers, camera equipment, and huge amounts of ashtrays bursting with cigarette butts that had never been emptied. It was what was on the wall of the living room that made our blood turn cold. There were photographs of boys my age around our neighbourhood that were stuck on the wall in a huge collage, including a photograph of my brother and I in our backyard. We couldn't imagine where this man had taken such a picture of us, and when we had done it, because we never noticed him taking it. On a table there were lots of photographs of missing boys that appeared to have been taken in his house. I did not know the missing boy personally, but I had seen photographs of him in the papers, and this picture was definitely of him. I looked at my brother in horror. "This man is a monster," I told him. "I think he has killed this boy." "Why?" asked my brother, looking perturbed. "Why would he do this to the poor boy?" "I don't know, but he's super weird," I said. Suddenly we heard the sound of our neighbour returning. Wherever he had been there quick, and now he was coming back. I began to wonder if he had dumped the body in the local lake. We could hear the car door slamming and footsteps coming towards the kitchen. We had not been prepared for this man to get back so quickly. My brother and I tried to slip out of the house as fast as we could, but our feet made a shuffling noise on the gravel. My brother, also in a state of panic, knocked over the flower pot, making things worse with his foot, and it crashed on the ground, making a massive sound. "Who is there?" called the neighbour, dashing towards us with a trowel raised in his hands. The neighbour saw my brother and I staring back at him with frightened, terrified eyes, and we bolted into the woods at the back of the properties that stretched back for miles. We knew that those woods would be the perfect place to hide out, because the trees were very big and there was a lot of dense undergrowth there. We could hear that the neighbour was running after us and shouting, "Come here, boys! Come here! Come here, boys!" As we raced through the woods, we were so terrified because we knew this man would hurt us and possibly even kill us, and we knew we were in mortal danger. Finally, we found the perfect hiding spot in a hollowed-out area of a huge tree that was covered with a mossy curtain. I knew the tree very well. I had discovered it once quite by accident, and discovered that it possessed such a huge hollowed-out cavity within its wide trunk. It was a perfect hiding spot, because we would be very unlikely to be discovered. In that moment I was glad that my brother and I had frequented this forest regularly, and knew the area like the back of our hands, because we could navigate our way well around the space. I think it must have been a full moon, because for a dark night the area seemed incredibly light, as the moonlight came flooding through the canopy, made brighter by the man's flashlight, which he held in one hand and his trowel in the other. He was calling out to us while he searched for us. "I know you're there. Come out, boys," he would shout. "I'm not angry with you. I have a lovely present for you. Why don't you come out now?" My brother and I were breathing heavily, and our hearts were racing, and we were terrified. "Keep very still," I whispered to my brother. "He'll never find us here, I promise you. This hiding spot is brilliant." I was peering through the mossy curtain when I saw the horrible man, with a nasty smirk on his face, waving the flashlight over the forest area, near to where we were hiding. The beam went up and down the forest floor and to either side, and even between the trees. Suddenly we heard the strange whistling sound. I was relieved because I thought someone was coming at last. It was the middle of the night, though, so who could it be, I wondered. The old man straightened up, looking very concerned, and held out his huge yard trowel in his hand that he looked like he was going to use to strike down this person that was whistling. He hid behind a tree to get himself into a better position for a surprise attack. All this happened while my brother and I sat watching in horrified silence. Was he going to kill the person that was coming? I wondered all this in horror. Or maybe he was going to knock them unconscious. "We should warn the person that's coming," whispered my brother. "He might hurt them." "And give up our hiding place," I whispered. "No, we can't do that." The old man lashed out his yard trowel towards the stranger, and as he did this, a pair of long, muscular, hairy arms grabbed the trowel from his hands like it was a kid's toy. He then turned towards the man and let out a huge roar that sounded exactly like a lion. "What on earth is that?" I whispered to my brother. "It's a hairy monster." Our neighbour looked utterly terrified, and his legs were wobbling, and he was shouting, "No! No, please, no, no, no!" The creature using the trowel pounded our neighbour's head with a blow that sounded like an egg being cracked wide open. I knew in that instant he was dead, because his body lay there limp and lifeless. The creature then made a few grunts and heaved the man onto his shoulders like a sack of potatoes and glided gracefully through the woods towards the gravel road where we lived, all the while whistling quite happily to himself. "What's he doing?" whispered my brother. "I think he's throwing the body onto the road so that it can be found away from the forest. He's clever, whatever he is." "What is he?" whispered my brother. "I have absolutely no clue," I said. "I've never seen anything remotely like him before." "He looks like a monster ape-man," said my brother. The creature was indeed huge, at the very least 800 pounds, and 8 foot tall, and 4 to 5 feet wide, with a cone-shaped head, long face, long arms, and hair from top to the bottom was all shaggy and black. "Supposing he kills us," said my brother. "He won't," I assured him. "We'll hide until he's gone." The creature returned, and was still whistling to himself, and he continued on his way through the forest, and then he was finally gone. My brother and I raced home as fast as we could, and woke up our parents to tell them that the neighbours had killed the missing boy and dumped his body in the lake, and had chased after us in the woods, and we had hidden and observed him being killed by an ape-man. My parents did not believe a word of what we were saying, and they insisted we went to bed and stop making up all these dreadful stories. The next day our neighbour's lifeless body was discovered lying in the middle of the gravel road, and his house was searched by the police, and they believed that he was indeed responsible for several missing boys and was called a paedophile that they had been looking for many long months. It did not seem that the police were at all concerned about the mysterious cause of his death, or more likely, they just didn't care. Months later, divers went searching in the lake, and 3 little boys' bodies were recovered there. It was all exceedingly sad for our rural community, who could not believe that this had happened on our turf. My parents were mortified that this awful man had lived opposite us, but refused to acknowledge that we, as her children, had been right about everything. My brother and I never got to see the hairy man again, and even though we tried to tell our parents about the creature that we had seen, they told us to stop making up ridiculous stories and that no such creature ever existed. My mother would say we needed to learn to be credible, and that if we spoke to people like this, we would be in all kinds of trouble. It was only about in 2013 that I was to learn that this creature is called Bigfoot. I have no idea whether he would have hurt us or not, but he did get a trowel rammed into his face by that neighbour of ours, and so maybe he was just fighting back. I guess we'll never really know. As for my mother, she got her wish. Someone completely bulldozed the house opposite us and rebuilt the home, which had a manicured lawn and terraced garden, and turned out to be almost as meticulous as my mother's yard. As you can imagine, my mother loved our new neighbours, and to make matters even better, they had 2 boys our age, which we grew to spend so much time with in the years that followed.
Wow, what an incredible story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.